Okay, so in the last lecture we talked about how eyewitness testimony or eyewitness identification, though it's often considered to be very compelling, can be inaccurate based on a number of different factors. And what I want to do in this lecture is talk briefly about some of the things that we can do to minimize the likelihood that a potential eyewitness would make a false identification of a suspect. Research has shown us there are several different things that we can do to minimize the likelihood that a potential eyewitness would make a faulty identification. One of the things that research has shown us is that when an officer is conducting the lineup, if that officer doesn't have knowledge of who the potential suspect might be in the lineup, then that officer is less likely to unintentionally or unconsciously present information to the eyewitness that might skew their perception of what they remember or who is actually the person that they recall as being a potential suspect. So we call that a blind lineup procedure, and that basically just means that the officer conducting the lineup has no knowledge of who the suspect might be. One of the other things that we can do to minimize the likelihood of a faulty identification is to use bias-reducing instructions when an officer conducts a lineup. So what we mean by that is basically that if the officer who is conducting the lineup informs the eyewitness that the suspect may not actually be in the lineup, it reduces the likelihood that the eyewitness feels compelled to identify someone, and thereby reduces the likelihood that they will make a false identification. One of the other ways that we can reduce the likelihood of false identification is to use an unbiased lineup. And what that simply means is that when the suspects are either standing in front of the eyewitness or the eyewitness is shown photos of potential suspects, that the group of suspects that the eyewitness is asked to choose from all look kind of similar to one another. You don't want you don't want one individual to stand out from the rest of the group. And so if you look at this picture here, you can see that you've got four guys who look sort of like Charlie Chaplin, and then this one really tall guy in the middle. Research has shown us that if an individual stands out from the group that he is being compared to, that oftentimes that may be some sort of factor that increases the likelihood that the eyewitness will make a faulty identification. And as you can see here, if it's a live lineup where the individuals are all standing together, you want to have people who look similar to one another. If it's a group of pictures, and sometimes what you'll see is a photo array of about 6 pictures of suspects, you want to have similar facial expressions, similar skin tone, that kind of thing, to reduce the likelihood that the eyewitness makes an identification based solely on the fact that the individual stands out from the others in the group. And when an eyewitness does this, they may not actually know that that's why they're selecting that individual. It may be sort of an unconscious process of which they're unaware. One of the things that we have learned from research is that when an eyewitness is actually making their initial determination of whether a person is actually a suspect, they sometimes can take a really long time to make their determination. And what the research shows us is that the more time it takes the more time it takes an eyewitness to make an identification, the less likely that identification is to be accurate. What the research shows us is that if an eyewitness is truly confident in their decision, they should be able to make a decision about whether or not they saw that individual within about 10 seconds. And the longer it takes them, if it takes a long time for that eyewitness to identify a potential suspect, there may be some other kind of processes taking place that are, they maybe feel compelled to identify a suspect, or some other factor may be taking place. So we really want them to be able to identify a suspect pretty quickly. Finally, some of the things that we can do to reduce the likelihood of false identifications is to have the eyewitness provide a confidence rating at the time that they initially identify the suspect. So if the eyewitness is shown a group of 6 pictures and they identify one of those pictures as being the suspect, officers should ask that eyewitness, how strongly do you feel that this is the person that committed the crime? And hopefully what that will do is, I think I mentioned earlier in the last lecture, that as the longer the time period is from when the suspect is initially identified to the time that the witness may have to testify, sometimes our confidence ratings actually increase over time. If we take a confidence rating at the time of the initial identification, that gives us a better picture of how confident the eyewitness is that they selected the right suspect. One of the other things that we can do to help reduce the likelihood of false confessions is to record or provide a video recording of all of the eyewitness lineup procedures, so that the courts can review what happened during those eyewitness identifications and see if there were any kind of actions taken by the officers, or any kinds of leading questions or those kinds of things that might result in a false confession. We can also reduce the likelihood of a false identification by providing sequential lineups. So, for example, rather than having an entire group of 6 or 7 people standing in front of a potential eyewitness at the same time, we can bring each suspect in, have the eyewitness look at the suspect and determine whether or not that eyewitness actually saw that person one at a time, so they don't have some sort of comparison effect where they feel like they have to compare the suspect that they're looking at with the other people who might be in that lineup. And the research has shown that if we do a sequential lineup, meaning that we just do them sort of one by one, it increases the accuracy of the eyewitness's identification. And then finally, although this isn't something that would necessarily happen when the eyewitness identifies a suspect, courts can use expert testimony about the accuracy of eyewitness identification to inform the judge or the jury about errors that may occur during the eyewitness identification process. And that helps the judge or the jury get a better understanding of the errors that may be included in the process of making an eyewitness identification. We're going to wrap up with that. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions. Thanks.